On the morning of July 24, 1944, Commander Takeo Shigematsu of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 3rd Bureau, the intelligence division responsible for tracking American capabilities in the Central Pacific, submitted his weekly assessment to Combined Fleet Headquarters at Yokosuka. The report, stamped with the chrysanthemum seal that marked it for flag officer circulation only, contained a single paragraph that would haunt Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. American forces secured Saipan on July 9th, based on established construction rates observed at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, and confirmed engineering limitations of coral substrate. We assess that a functional bomber airfield capable of supporting B-29 operations cannot be operational before January 1945. More probable estimate, March 1945. The enemy will require a minimum of 6 months to grade terrain, construct hard stands, establish fuel storage, and complete runway surfaces adequate for heavy bomber operations. This timeline provides sufficient opportunity to reinforce homeland air defenses. Shigematsu had done his calculations with the rigor expected of a graduate of the Imperial Naval Academy's technical program. He had studied American engineering doctrine. He had analyzed reconnaissance photographs from Guadalcanal, where the Marines had required 4 months to render Henderson Field operational for fighter aircraft, and Henderson had been built on an existing Japanese foundation. Saipan would be constructed from nothing, on terrain the Americans had just finished bombing into rubble. 6 months was, if anything, conservative. He did not know about the Seabees. He did not know about the 8,500 men of the 67th, 81st, and 121st Naval Construction Battalions already unloading earth-moving equipment onto Saipan's beaches, while Japanese holdouts still fired from caves in the island's northern cliffs. He did not know about the 350 bulldozers, 200 road graders, and 85 asphalt plants being assembled from components shipped across 4,000 miles of ocean. He did not know that American construction doctrine had evolved beyond anything Japanese intelligence had ever observed or imagined. 47 days after Commander Shigematsu submitted his assessment on October 12, 1944, the first B-29 Superfortress touched down on Isley Field, Saipan. The runway was 8,500 feet long. The taxiways could accommodate 60 bombers simultaneously. The fuel storage facilities held 750,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. The Japanese had expected 6 months. The Americans had delivered in 7 weeks, and the bombers that Commander Shigematsu had assured his superiors would not arrive until spring were already loading incendiaries for the first raids on the Japanese homeland. What followed was not merely a strategic miscalculation, it was the collapse of an entire framework for understanding American power. A framework built on the assumption that engineering was engineering, that rock was rock, that certain physical laws constrained what could be accomplished in a given span of time. The Americans, it turned out, had different laws. Japanese confidence in their construction timeline estimates was not arrogance. It was arithmetic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built airfields across the Pacific for over a decade. Their engineers understood coral, volcanic rock, and tropical soil with an intimacy born from hard experience. They knew that compacting a runway surface adequate for heavy aircraft required specific equipment, specific materials, and specific time. There were no shortcuts. Physics did not negotiate. Captain Yoshiro Minami, Chief Engineering Officer for the Combined Fleet's Base Construction Division, had written the definitive Japanese manual on Pacific airfield development in 1941. His calculations were precise. A 6,000-foot runway suitable for medium bombers required 120 days under optimal conditions. A runway capable of handling aircraft in the B-29's weight class, 140,000 pounds fully loaded, demanded foundations that could withstand 200 pounds per square inch of surface pressure. Such foundations required crushed coral compacted in 6-inch lifts. Each lift rolled and tested before the next could be applied. The process could not be accelerated. The mathematics were immutable. Construction is not warfare, Minami had lectured at the Yokosuka Naval Engineering School in 1943. In battle, spirit can overcome material disadvantage. In construction, material is everything. A runway that fails under the weight of an aircraft kills pilots as surely as enemy fighters. There is no courage that can make weak concrete strong. Japanese intelligence had studied American construction with methodical attention. They had aerial photographs of Henderson Field's development, tracking its progress week by week through 1942 and 1943. They had interrogated captured American engineers from Guadalcanal, learning the specifications of their equipment, the training of their personnel, the logistics of their supply chains. What they learned confirmed Minami's calculations. The Americans built at approximately the same rate as the Japanese, sometimes slightly faster, due to superior equipment, but bound by the same physical constraints. The critical variable was substrate. Coral atolls presented unique challenges. The material was porous, prone to crumbling under repeated stress, and required extensive preparation before it could bear heavy loads. The Japanese had spent 18 months constructing their airfield on Tarawa. The Americans, after capturing the island, had required 4 months to repair it for operational use. Similar timelines applied across the theater. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, the Gilberts. Engineering was engineering. 6 months for a B-29 capable field was not a guess. It was science. What Japanese intelligence had failed to observe, what they had no framework to comprehend, was that the Americans had been redesigning the science itself. The problem had been identified in early 1942, when war planners in Washington recognized that the island-hopping strategy would require airfields at a pace that conventional construction could not deliver. Admiral Ben Moriel, chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, had posed the question to his staff in terms that bordered on heresy. Forget what we know about how long construction takes. Tell me how fast it could take if we rebuilt everything, the equipment, the training, the doctrine, from the ground up. The answer had required 2 years and $2.4 billion to develop. New machines, the Marston Mat system that could create an operational runway surface in hours rather than weeks. New materials, rapid-setting Portland cement that achieved 80% strength in 72 hours rather than the standard 28 days. New methods, prefabricated components that arrived by ship already fitted for assembly. New men, the Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees, trained not as soldiers who could build, but as builders who could fight. By the summer of 1944, the Seabees had become something the Japanese had never encountered and could not have predicted. An industrial army capable of projecting manufacturing power across oceans, transforming hostile coral atolls into operational air bases, while enemy snipers still harassed their perimeters. Commander Shigematsu's 6-month estimate was not wrong by his standards. It was simply calculated in a language the Americans had stopped speaking. The new American language was measured in days, not months, and the Seabees were about to deliver a lesson in vocabulary. The Naval Construction Battalions were born from a legal technicality and a rear admiral's fury. In December 1941, civilian contractors employed by the Navy at Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines found themselves in an impossible position. International law prohibited civilians from taking up arms. Doing so forfeited their protected status and made them subject to execution as irregular combatants. Yet Japanese forces were attacking bases where these men worked alongside Marines, and the distinction between builder and fighter became meaningless when bombs were falling on both. On Wake Island, 1,200 civilian workers from Morrison-Knudsen Corporation watched the Japanese invasion unfold with hammers in their hands. Some picked up rifles from fallen Marines and fought anyway, knowing the consequences. 47 were executed after capture. The rest spent the war in prison camps, where their civilian status offered no protection from forced labor, starvation, or casual murder. Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, a 49-year-old civil engineer from Salt Lake City who had risen to command the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, received reports of the Wake Island executions in February 1942. His response was immediate: never again. "We need military construction units," Moriel wrote in his proposal to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, dated December 28, 1941, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. "Men who can build under fire and fight when necessary. Men who wear uniforms, carry rank, and cannot be executed for defending themselves. Men who are soldiers because they build, not despite it. The concept faced resistance from every direction. The Army argued that construction was an Army Corps of Engineers' responsibility. The Marine Corps questioned why builders needed military training beyond basic self-defense. Budget officers blanched at the cost of equipping construction units with both building equipment and combat weapons. One War Department memorandum dismissed the proposal as an expensive redundancy that would produce neither adequate soldiers nor adequate builders. Moriel fought for 4 months. He won on March 5, 1942, when the 1st Naval Construction Battalion was authorized at Camp Allen, Virginia. The men who answered the call were not typical recruits. The Navy wanted experience over youth, skill over fitness. The average Seabee was 37 years old, a decade older than the average Marine. They came from union halls and construction sites across America. Ironworkers from Pittsburgh, heavy equipment operators from California's Central Valley, electricians from Chicago, carpenters from the Pacific Northwest. Many had built the dams and bridges of the New Deal. Now they would build the infrastructure of the Pacific War. Chief Petty Officer Joseph Bull Ramsey, who would later lead the equipment platoon of the 67th Naval Construction Battalion at Saipan, had spent 15 years operating bulldozers for the Tennessee Valley Authority before enlisting at age 41. His training records noted that he could move 800 cubic yards of earth per 8-hour shift, nearly double the rate of operators half his age. "These boys know machines like infantry knows rifles," Ramsey remarked during training at Camp Peary, Virginia. "Give us the steel and the diesel and we'll build you an airfield on the moon. Just get us there and keep the Japs off our backs long enough to pour concrete." The Seabees trained for 6 weeks, half the duration of Marine boot camp, but their curriculum was unlike any military program in existence. Mornings were spent on rifle ranges and close combat. Afternoons were devoted to earth-moving equipment, asphalt plants, and rapid construction techniques developed specifically for Pacific conditions. They learned to operate bulldozers with rifles strapped across their backs. They practiced laying Marston mat, interlocking steel planking that could transform bare coral into a functional runway in hours, while instructors fired live ammunition over their heads. The equipment they brought to war was as revolutionary as their training. The Caterpillar D8 bulldozer, weighing 30,000 pounds and producing 184 horsepower, could move terrain that Japanese engineers shifted by hand. The Laturno Tornapole, a motorized scraper capable of loading, transporting, and dumping 22 cubic yards of material in a single pass, replaced hundreds of laborers with a single operator. Asphalt batch plants that could produce 60 tons per hour. Portable rock crushers, prefabricated steel hangars that arrived in numbered crates, ready for assembly like monstrous furniture. Japanese construction units had nothing comparable. Their equipment was lighter, designed for transport by ship and manhandling ashore. Their doctrine emphasized labor over machinery. Thousands of men with shovels could accomplish what American machines did faster, but not faster enough. Not nearly fast enough. By the time the Seabees landed on Saipan in July 1944, they had already proven their capabilities at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Kwajalein. Each operation had refined their methods, compressed their timelines, sharpened their efficiency. They had learned to begin construction, while combat operations continued, laying runway foundations 2,000 yards from active firefights, working through the night under blackout conditions, accepting sniper casualties as the cost of acceleration. "The Japanese think we'll wait until the island is secure," wrote Commander Paul Grubb of the 121st NCB in a letter to his wife dated July 6, 1944, 3 days before Saipan was officially declared captured. "They're calculating our start date from the end of the battle. They don't understand that we started the day we landed. By the time their intelligence figures out what we're doing, we'll already be done." Grubb was right about the timeline. He underestimated how badly the Japanese would miscalculate. The Seabees' reputation for miracles had been purchased with blood and failure. Guadalcanal had been the crucible, and very nearly the grave. When the 6th Naval Construction Battalion landed on August 7, 1942, they carried with them the untested theories of a new doctrine and equipment that had never operated in combat conditions. Within 72 hours, those theories collided with reality. The coral substrate of Henderson Field, which reconnaissance photographs had suggested was firm and workable, proved to be a crumbling nightmare. Heavy equipment broke through surface crusts into pockets of powder that swallowed bulldozer treads whole. 3D7 caterpillars were mired beyond recovery in the first week. The prefabricated Marston mat, designed to be laid directly on prepared coral, buckled and warped under aircraft weight when the foundation shifted beneath it. On August 20th, a Marine F-4F Wildcat caught its landing gear in a mat seam that had separated by 4 inches overnight, flipping the aircraft and killing the pilot. Lieutenant Commander Harry Stevenson, commanding the 6th NCB, faced a crisis that threatened to discredit the entire CB concept before it had proven itself. His after-action report, classified until 1958, documented the desperation. Equipment losses in first 10 days: 4 bulldozers, 2 graders, 1 crane. Personnel casualties from Japanese air raids and sniper fire: 14 killed, 31 wounded. Runway surface failing at multiple points. Marine Air Group 23 cannot sustain operations at current sortie rate due to landing surface conditions. Have requested additional engineering assessment from Pearl Harbor. Am uncertain current methods are adequate for Pacific conditions. The Japanese noticed reconnaissance flights over Henderson Field in late August 1942 photographed the struggling construction efforts, and the images circulated through Imperial Navy intelligence with dismissive annotations. Captain Minami himself reviewed the photographs and concluded that American construction capabilities, while adequately equipped, suffered from fundamental incompetence in tropical substrate management. The Americans build like they fight, Minami wrote in his September 1942 assessment. With impressive machinery and inadequate understanding, their equipment is superior. Their technique is crude. They will require many more months to render Henderson Field serviceable, by which time our forces will have retaken the island. He was nearly right. Through September and October 1942, the Seabees struggled against terrain, weather, and constant Japanese bombardment. The Tokyo Express, the nightly destroyer, runs that shelled Henderson Field with impunity, destroyed construction progress faster than it could be completed. On the night of October 13th, 2 Japanese battleships pumped 973 14-inch shells into the airfield in 90 minutes, cratering the runway in 17 places and destroying half the aviation fuel reserves. By dawn, Henderson Field was inoperable. It took the 6th NCB 4 days to restore flight operations, 4 days during which the Marines' air cover vanished and Japanese reinforcements landed unopposed. Skepticism festered within American command. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marine ground forces on Guadalcanal, questioned whether the Seabees could deliver the rapid construction their doctrine promised. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding amphibious forces, suggested in a November 1942 memorandum that construction responsibilities should be transferred to Army engineers, who had greater experience in sustained combat zone operations. The Seabees survived these criticisms for one reason: there was no alternative. The Army engineers were committed to the European theater. The Marine Corps had no construction capability beyond basic field engineering. If the Navy's experiment failed, there would be no Pacific airfields at all. What saved the Seabee program was not a single breakthrough, but 1,000 small adaptations hammered out under fire. Chief Petty Officer Samuel Ironhead Morrison of the 6th NCB developed a coral compaction technique using captured Japanese hand rollers in combination with American machinery, a hybrid approach that stabilized substrates resistant to mechanical compression alone. Petty Officer 2nd Class William Tanaka, a civil engineer from Los Angeles whose parents had been interned at Manzanar, designed a Marston mat anchoring system that prevented the buckling that had killed the F-4F pilot in August. The modifications were unofficial, unrecognized, and essential. By December 1942, Henderson Field was handling 100 aircraft sorties per day. By February 1943, it was the most active airfield in the South Pacific. The techniques developed under fire became standard doctrine, distributed through mimeographed bulletins to every Seabee battalion in the theater. But the Japanese intelligence apparatus did not update its assessments. Captain Minami's September 1942 evaluation of American construction as crude remained the baseline reference through 1943 and into 1944. The adaptations at Henderson Field were invisible to reconnaissance photography. The doctrinal innovations were classified beyond Japanese access. The revolution happening within the CB battalions, the compression of construction timelines from months to weeks to days, went unobserved. When Commander Shigematsu calculated his 6-month estimate for Saipan, he was using data that was 2 years out of date. He was measuring the Americans of 1942. The Americans of 1944 were a different species entirely. July 10, 1944. D+15 on Saipan. The northern third of the island remained in Japanese hands. Chief Petty Officer Joseph Bull Ramsey climbed into the cab of his D-8 Caterpillar at 0430 before the sun had cleared the horizon. The machine had been offloaded from LST 447 36 hours earlier, its bright yellow factory paint already filmed with volcanic dust and diesel soot. Ramsey had slept 4 hours in the past 2 days. He would sleep 3 in the next 2. This was not exhaustion. This was simply the tempo of operations. The terrain before him was chaos, a lunar landscape of shell craters, shattered palm stumps, and the occasional Japanese corpse not yet collected by Graves registration. 1,400 yards to the north, the crackle of rifle fire marked the forward edge of the Marine advance. Somewhere in that direction, several thousand Japanese soldiers were still fighting, still dying, still convinced they could hold the island. The Seabees were not waiting for them to finish. We started grading the runway center line while mortars were still falling, Ramsey wrote in a letter to his wife dated July 28, 1944. The skipper had us working in 4 shifts, 6 hours on, 6 hours off, around the clock. The first night, a Jap sniper put 3 rounds through my cab. 1 went through the seat 6 inches from my hip. I kept grading. What else was I going to do? The Marines were counting on us. The flyboys were counting on us. We had a schedule. The schedule was Commander Paul Grubb's masterwork, a construction timeline so aggressive that his own officers had questioned his sanity when he distributed it on July 8th. Easley Field, as the new airfield would be designated, was to be operational for B-29 superfortresses by October 1st, not a rough fighter strip, not a temporary emergency field. A full bomber facility with 8,500 feet of paved runway, parallel taxiways, 120 hard stands, fuel storage for 750,000 gallons, and maintenance hangars capable of servicing the largest aircraft in the American arsenal. 83 days. The Japanese had estimated 6 months for such a facility. Grubb intended to deliver it in less than 12 weeks. What happened over the following weeks would redefine what was possible in military construction. The 67th, 81st, and 121st Naval Construction Battalions operated as a single organism, 8,500 men moving in choreographed shifts that never stopped, never slowed, never acknowledged darkness or exhaustion, or the crack of Japanese rifles from the shrinking perimeter to the north. Bulldozers worked in pairs, one grading while the other covered with its blade angled as a shield against sniper fire. Asphalt plants ran continuously, their crews rotating every 4 hours to maintain alertness at machinery that could maim an inattentive operator in an instant. Marston Mat arrived by the shipload. 3.2 million square feet of interlocking steel planking that Seabees laid at a rate of 150 linear feet per hour, working on hands and knees with wrenches and hammers, while Japanese artillery occasionally reminded them that the battle was not yet over. On July 18th, 8 days after construction began, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographed Easley Field from 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Akira Nomura, the intelligence officer who analyzed the images at Yokosuka, noted in his preliminary report that the Americans had begun preliminary grading operations and appeared to be establishing equipment staging areas. His assessment, consistent with expected early-phase construction, no revision to operational timeline required. He was looking at a runway that was already 60% complete. The disconnect between Japanese expectation and American reality was not merely a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. Nomura's analysts could see the bulldozers, the graders, the supply dumps accumulating along the shore. What they could not comprehend was the pace, the relentless, mechanical, around-the-clock velocity of construction that compressed 6 months of work into 6 weeks. The moment of revelation came on August 10th. A Japanese naval patrol submarine, I-38, surfaced briefly off Saipan's western coast at dusk to recharge batteries and transmit a position report. Through his periscope, Commander Zenji Orita observed something that made him request confirmation from his executive officer, convinced his eyes were failing. Where 30 days earlier there had been cratered wasteland, there was now a fully operational military airfield. Runway lights glowed in the gathering darkness. Aircraft, large aircraft, 4-engined aircraft, lined the taxiways. Fuel trucks moved between hard stands. The control tower was operational, its windows illuminated. Orita's contact report, transmitted to Combined Fleet Headquarters at 21:47 on August 10th, contained a single sentence that would circulate through Japanese intelligence with the force of a depth charge. Aslito Airfield appears fully operational. Estimate 40 to 50 heavy bombers present. Request verification. Timeline inconsistent with previous assessments. Timeline inconsistent. The phrase was a masterpiece of understatement. The Japanese had calculated construction would not be complete until January 1945. The Americans had finished in 1 month. Not mostly finished, not provisionally operational, finished. Bombers on the ground, fuel in the tanks, the infrastructure of strategic annihilation assembled in 30 days on an island where Japanese soldiers were still dying in caves. Commander Shigematsu received Orita's contact report the following morning. His hands trembled as he read it, a detail noted by 3 different witnesses and recorded in post-war interrogation transcripts. He requested aerial reconnaissance confirmation. When the photographs arrived on August 14th, showing not only Isley Field, but the simultaneous construction of a second major airfield at Kobler, Shigematsu is reported to have said nothing for several minutes. He simply stared at the images, the cigarette in his hand burning down to his fingers unnoticed. The mathematics he had trusted, the doctrine he had studied, the timelines he had calculated with such precision, all of it was ash. The Americans had not merely beaten his estimate, they had made it irrelevant. The bombers came 11 days later. On October 12, 1944, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell stood on the newly paved runway of Isley Field and watched the first B-29 Superfortress touch down on Saipan. The aircraft, nicknamed Jolton Josie, had flown 3,200 miles from Kansas, crossed the Pacific in stages, and now rolled to a stop on concrete that had not existed 3 months earlier. Hansell saluted the pilot, accepted a bottle of whiskey from the crew chief, and turned to address the assembled Seabees who had made the moment possible. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have just brought the war to Japan's doorstep." Within 2 weeks, 119 B-29s were operational on Saipan. Within a month, 217. The Seabees were not finished. They were never finished. But they had delivered a strategic bombing capability 9 months ahead of the timeline Japanese intelligence had predicted. Every day that Commander Shigematsu's estimate remained unfulfilled was a day when American bombers could strike targets that should have been beyond reach. The Japanese scrambled to comprehend what had happened. Intelligence assessments that had been considered authoritative were discarded and rewritten. Captain Minami's 1942 construction doctrine, still the standard reference, was officially withdrawn from circulation on October 28, 1944, with a memorandum noting that American engineering capabilities have apparently undergone substantial revision not reflected in current analysis. Substantial revision. The phrase was bureaucratic camouflage for complete bewilderment. What the Japanese could not grasp, what their intelligence apparatus had no framework to process, was that Saipan was not an anomaly. It was a template. The same battalions, the same equipment, the same impossible timelines were being replicated across the Pacific with the relentless precision of an assembly line. Tinian, 12 miles south of Saipan, invaded on July 24, 1944. The 13th, 38th, 107th, and 121st Naval Construction Battalions landed with the assault waves, bulldozers rolling off LSTs while Marines were still clearing the beaches. Northfield, designed to accommodate 200 B-29s, the largest operational airfield in the world, was operational in 60 days. By March 1945, it would launch the Enola Gay, Guam, invaded on July 21, 1944. The 25th, 53rd, and 77th NCBs began construction on Northwest Field before the island was secured, 45 days from bare jungle to operational B-29 base. Iwo Jima. Even as Marines bled for every yard of volcanic rock, Seabees from the 31st, 62nd, and 133rd NCBS followed behind them, grading and paving and building. The first P-51 Mustangs landed on Iwo Jima's central field on March 6, 1945, 15 days after D-Day, while fighting still raged in the island's northern caves. Each island fell, and within weeks, not months, weeks, American bombers were flying from runways that Japanese strategic planning had assumed would not exist until the following year. The cushion of time that Tokyo had counted on, the breathing room that would have allowed them to reinforce home island defenses, evaporated like water on hot tarmac. Lieutenant General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, convened an emergency assessment conference on November 15, 1944, following the first B-29 raids on Tokyo. The meeting's classified minutes, captured after the war, recorded a debate that bordered on despair. "The Americans are constructing airfields faster than we can destroy them," Umezu stated. "Our intelligence indicated Saipan would not support heavy bomber operations until spring. Bombers flew from Saipan last month. Our intelligence indicated Tinian construction would require until summer 1945. Tinian is operational now. We are making strategic decisions based on timelines that no longer correspond to reality." Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of Japanese Naval Air Forces, responded with a question that no one present could answer. How are they doing this? What have we failed to understand? What they had failed to understand was scale, not just the scale of American equipment or manpower, but the scale of American logistical imagination, the capacity to treat construction itself as a weapon system, to industrialize the building of airfields the way Ford had industrialized the building of automobiles. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Between June 1944 and August 1945, the Seabees constructed or significantly upgraded 111 major airstrips in the Pacific Theater. 111. They built 441 piers, bridges, and causeways. They paved 2,558 miles of roadway. They erected 700 square blocks of warehouses. They did this while under fire, while treating their own wounded, while burying their own dead. 1,079 Seabees killed in action, 5,200 wounded. The Japanese had believed that construction was a constraint, a bottleneck that limited how quickly American power could be projected across the Pacific. They had built their defensive strategy around that assumption. They had calculated that every island lost would buy time, weeks, and months during which airfields could not threaten the homeland. The Seabees had turned that constraint into a weapon. Every island lost became an airfield gained, not eventually, not after a respectable interval of construction, but immediately, within days of capture. The Pacific was not a barrier. It was a highway being paved in real time, and every mile of it pointed toward Tokyo. By December 1944, Japanese war planners had stopped attempting to predict American construction timelines. The estimates were always wrong. The reality was always worse. "We calculate, and the Americans ignore our calculations," wrote Rear Admiral Sadatoshi Tomioka in his diary on December 12, 1944. "We prepare for the enemy we expect, and a different enemy arrives, one that builds as fast as he destroys, who carries his bases with him like a turtle carries its shell. There is no island distant enough to be safe. There is no timeline long enough to prepare. They are not crossing the Pacific, they are annexing it." The Seabees had become the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy, not the factories in Detroit or the shipyards in Virginia, but the factory that traveled, the shipyard that landed with the Marines, the impossible machine that transformed hostile coral into American territory in the time it took Japanese planners to file their assessments. And they were not slowing down. They were accelerating. The final accounting defied comprehension. In the 14 months between June 1944 and August 1945, the Naval Construction Battalions completed more military construction in the Pacific Theater than the Japanese had accomplished in the previous decade of occupation and fortification. The numbers existed beyond argument, stamped in official reports and verified by post-war surveys that Japanese officers were forced to witness before they could deny them. Runways, 7.3 million square yards of paved surface, enough to cover Manhattan from river to river. Fuel storage, 100 million gallons of capacity constructed, sufficient to keep the entire B-29 fleet airborne for 6 months without resupply. Housing, 300,000 Quonset huts assembled, each one erected in an average of 4 hours by crews who had reduced the process to industrial choreography. Hospitals, 67,000 beds installed across the theater, many in facilities that exceeded the medical infrastructure of Japanese prefectures. Fresh water, 75 million gallons per day of distillation and purification capacity, created on islands where Japanese garrisons had rationed rainwater. The physical evidence was undeniable, but the testimony of those who had calculated differently, who had staked strategy on timelines that evaporated like morning fog, carried a weight that statistics alone could not convey. Commander Takeo Shigematsu, the intelligence officer whose 6-month estimate had been shattered within weeks, survived the war and was interrogated at length by American naval intelligence in September 1945. His testimony, recorded across 4 days at the Yokosuka Naval Base, became a primary source document for post-war analysis of Japanese intelligence failures. On the 3rd day, Lieutenant Commander Harold Bixby asked him directly, "At what point did you recognize that your construction assessments were incorrect?" Shigematsu's response filled 3 typewritten pages. The key passage was later excerpted for circulation to the Naval War College. "I understood the error intellectually when Commander Orita's submarine report arrived in August 1944, but I did not truly comprehend until I saw the reconnaissance photographs from Tinian in October. The Americans had constructed an airfield complex larger than anything we had built in the home islands, larger than Atsugi, larger than Yokosuka, in 60 days, on an island they had invaded 60 days before. I had spent my career studying engineering constraints. I understood soil mechanics, equipment capabilities, labor requirements. What I did not understand was that the Americans had made engineering constraints irrelevant. They did not work faster than we calculated. They worked in a way that made calculation meaningless." Bixby pressed further. "What should Japanese intelligence have done differently?" Shigematsu paused for nearly a minute before answering, a silence noted in the transcript with unusual editorial precision. "We should have sent observers to America before the war, not to their military bases, to their highway construction projects, to their dam sites, to watch them build Hoover Dam or the Golden Gate Bridge. We understood American weapons. We studied their aircraft, their ships, their tactics, but we never studied how they built. We assumed construction was construction, that a bulldozer was a bulldozer, that concrete was concrete. We did not understand that they had industrialized the act of building itself. They did not construct airfields. They manufactured them. Captain Yoshiro Minami, the engineering officer whose 1941 doctrine had established the baseline for Japanese construction estimates, was captured on Okinawa in June 1945 and interrogated at Guam. His testimony carried the particular bitterness of a man whose life's work had been proven worthless. "I wrote the manual that told our commanders what to expect from American engineers. Every estimate, every timeline, every assumption in that manual was wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. I said the Americans would need 4 months for a fighter strip. They built them in weeks. I said heavy bomber facilities required a year. They built them in months. I told our planners to expect breathing room after we lost an island, time to prepare, time to reinforce. There was no breathing room. The American bombers arrived before our assessments could be revised. My manual killed more Japanese soldiers than American bullets ever did, because it convinced our commanders they had time that did not exist." The most haunting testimony came not from intelligence officers but from the men who had waited in doomed defensive positions, watching American construction proceed with the inevitability of a natural disaster. Sergeant Major Hiroshi Takayama had served with the 43rd Division on Saipan, surviving in the northern caves until August 1944 before his capture. At a 1978 Veterans Reconciliation Conference in Honolulu, he addressed a mixed audience of American and Japanese survivors, with remarks that were later published in Pacific Historical Review. From our positions in the hills, we could see the Americans building, day and night. The noise never stopped. Engines, machinery, the sound of a country being constructed beneath us. We had been told to hold until reinforcements arrived. We had been told the Americans would need months to establish air operations. But we watched the runways appear like time-lapse photography. 1 week there was nothing. 2 weeks there was a road. 3 weeks there were aircraft. We knew then that no reinforcements would come. We knew that Japan had already lost, not because of the battle we were fighting, but because of the airfield we were watching. Every yard of concrete was a message. You cannot win. You can only wait to die while we build the machinery of your destruction in front of your eyes. Takayama wept openly during these remarks. So did several American Seabees in attendance, men who had built the runways he described, who had never considered how their work appeared to the enemy watching from the caves. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted between 1945 and 1947, devoted an entire volume to the role of construction capabilities in the Pacific victory. Its conclusion, drafted by a committee that included both military engineers and civilian economists, distilled the Seabee achievement into a single strategic assessment. Japanese defensive planning in the Pacific theater was predicated on the assumption that geography imposed constraints on American power projection, that distance and terrain would slow the tempo of operations to a pace that Japanese forces could contest. This assumption proved catastrophically incorrect. The naval construction battalions effectively eliminated geography as a strategic factor. Islands ceased to be obstacles and became stepping stones, each one converted to American use within weeks of capture. The speed of construction did not merely support military operations. It became a military operation in its own right, a weapon as decisive as any aircraft or warship in the American arsenal. The Japanese had believed that the Pacific was too vast, its islands too remote, its terrain too hostile for rapid American expansion. They had calculated their defensive timelines based on engineering realities that had been true for every previous war in human history. They had not accounted for the possibility that the Americans would simply change reality. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay lifted off from Northfield, Tinian, carrying a single weapon that would end the war. The runway beneath its wheels was 8,500 feet of crushed coral and asphalt, laid by the men of the 67th and 107th Naval Construction Battalions in 53 days. The fuel in its tanks had been pumped from storage facilities that had not existed 11 months earlier. The maintenance crews who had prepared the aircraft for flight worked in hangars assembled from prefabricated components shipped across 5,000 miles of ocean and erected in 72 hours. Every element of the mission, the airfield, the fuel, the infrastructure, the impossible logistics of projecting atomic power across the Pacific, rested on foundations that Commander Takeo Shigematsu had calculated would not exist until the summer of 1945. He had been right about the date. He had simply gotten the wrong island. Shigematsu survived the war. He returned to civilian life as an engineering consultant in Osaka, where he spent 3 decades helping to rebuild the country the B-29s had burned. In a 1971 interview with NHK on the 26th anniversary of Hiroshima, he was asked what single factor had most contributed to Japan's defeat. He did not mention the atomic bombs. He did not mention American naval superiority or air power or industrial capacity, at least not directly. Instead, he spoke of a morning in July 1944, standing at his desk in Yokosuka, calculating how long it would take the Americans to build an airfield on Saipan. "I was certain of my numbers," Shigematsu said. "I had studied American construction for years. I knew their equipment, their methods, their limitations. I gave our commanders 6 months. I told them we had time. He paused, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. The Americans built the airfield that ended our empire in 47 days. 47 days. And they built it while their Marines were still fighting for the island. I spent my career studying constraints. The Americans spent their war ignoring them. The Seabees came home to a nation that barely remembered their name. There were no ticker-tape parades for construction battalions. No Hollywood films celebrating men who operated bulldozers instead of machine guns. They mustered out quietly, returned to union halls and construction sites, and built the highways and suburbs of post-war America with the same methodical intensity they had brought to the Pacific. But the men who had fought against them remembered. At the 1985 reunion of the Japanese-American Veterans Association in Los Angeles, a frail man named Kenji Matsuda approached a group of former Seabees from the 121st NCB. Matsuda had been a signals officer on Saipan, one of the 921 Japanese soldiers who surrendered during the battle. He had spent the final weeks of the campaign watching the Americans build Isley Field from a cave overlooking the construction site, too wounded to fight, too stubborn to die. I watched you every day, Matsuda told the Seabees through an interpreter. Every day, more runway. Every day, more buildings. Every day, our hope died a little more. We had been told you were soft, decadent, that you could not endure hardship. He reached out and gripped the hand of Chief Petty Officer Samuel Morrison, the same Ironhead Morrison who had developed the hybrid compaction technique at Henderson Field 43 years earlier. You were not soft. You were relentless. You built a war machine in front of our eyes, and we could not stop you. We could not even slow you down. I have hated you for 40 years. But I think now what I hated was not you. It was the feeling of watching the future arrive and knowing we had no place in it. Morrison, 81 years old, his hands still calloused from a lifetime of labor, said nothing. He simply nodded and held the old soldier's grip until Matsuda released it. The Pacific War was won by many weapons: aircraft carriers and submarines, fighters and bombers, rifles and flamethrowers, and, finally, atomic fire. But beneath all of them, literally beneath them, lay the work of men who turned hostile quarrel into American territory faster than the enemy could comprehend. The Japanese had believed the Pacific was too vast to cross, its islands too remote to threaten them, its terrain too hostile for rapid exploitation. They had calculated timelines based on the assumption that geography was a constant, that distance imposed constraints no amount of machinery could overcome. They were wrong. The Seabees did not conquer the Pacific. They paved it. They crushed its coral and graded its volcanic rock and laid its Marston mat and poured its concrete until the ocean itself became an American highway, each island a rest stop on the road to Tokyo. Commander Shigematsu had given the empire 6 months. The Seabees gave them 47 days. And in that difference, in that impossible compression of time, that relentless velocity of construction, that refusal to acknowledge the constraints that every other nation on Earth accepted as immutable, lay the margin of victory. The Japanese built fortresses to hold the Pacific. The Americans built runways to take it. The runways won.